Okay, so in my previous class, I talked about the respiration in different animals and I stopped at the respiration in birds. So, respiration, as if you remember, I told you that they have trachea, they have anterior sacs, lung, and the posterior sacs. Now we'll see how this particular mechanism works. So let's imagine this is a pictorial representation of the respiratory system of the birds. So the fresh air or the air which is rich in oxygen from outside is taken up by the trachea. From trachea, it goes to the posterior sacs. Now these posterior sacs, they are kind of collapsed a little bit. Their contraction leads to the movement to the para-bronchi part of the lungs. Now from this para-bronchi part, this is kind of part of first cycle. Now at this particular stage, this anterior air sacs, they are contracted. Now in the second cycle, these parabronchi, from there the air moves to the to the anterior sacs. And now in the second phase, part of this particular cycle, these anterior sacs, they contract and the air moves outside. So in simple terms, what I want to say is that in mechanism, in the process of breathing, the air always moves from the trachea to the posterior. And when it is about to move outside, it is moving from the posterior to the anterior part. It is from the right to the left side. Okay, so this is a pictorial representation of the structure and mechanism of breathing. So let's imagine that this is the alveoli. Now in this alveoli, usually this is only one cell thing. So thickness of alveoli as well as the thickness of the fine blood vessels which are close to the alveoli is also one cell thing. Now, because of this one cell thickness, the total distance or the total path that the gases needs to travel is zero point 0.5 to 1.5 micrometers. So as all of you remember, the Fick's law, the distance is quite less. So if the distance is less, then the action will be facilitated. The diffusion of gases will be more. So if we look at this, the partial pressure values. So here the partial pressure value of oxygen is 105 mm of Hg, and the partial pressure value of CO2 is 40 mm of Hg. So this is quite high as compared to the blood, which is in the systemic veins. If you look at the values here, the partial pressure value of oxygen is 40 mm of Hg. So there is a difference of 65 units here. Also, the partial pressure of CO2 is 46 mm of Hg. So again, there is a difference of 6 units. So now when this blood, which is deoxygenated or having higher concentration of carbon dioxide and less concentration of oxygen, comes in contact to the alveolus. So here in the alveoli, there is rapid diffusion of CO2 to outside and O2 to inside. And ultimately, when they move to these pulmonary veins to the heart, from there to the systemic arteries, one can notice the partial pressure is 100 mm of Hg in case of oxygen and 40 mm of CO2. Now, this will go to the peripheral tissues where again the exchange of gases will take place. So, in the peripheral tissues, there will be diffusion of O2, and from peripheral tissues, there will be diffusion of CO2, and again we get the values of this. Partial pressure of oxygen 40 and CO2 is 46. So one can notice that it is the difference of partial pressure of the gases that is facilitating the diffusion of gases in or out. So depending on what is the partial pressure, the gases will diffuse. For instance, at the alveolar surface, the partial pressure of oxygen is quite high, so it needs to diffuse to the cells. However, at the tissues level, the partial pressure is less as compared to what is in the arteries. So the oxygen will diffuse to the tissues. On the contrary, if we talk about the carbon dioxide, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolus is less as compared to the arteries, the pulmonary artery. So it CO2 will diffuse from artery to the alveolus, and when this systemic arteries are taking blood from the alveolus to the tissues, there the partial pressure of CO2 is less as compared to the tissues. So the CO2 will diffuse from the tissues to the systemic arteries. So in higher organism, for example in humans, the process of respiration involves two steps. That is the inspiration and the expiration. So in inspiration, the diaphragm contracts. There is contraction of the intercostal muscles in the thoracic cavity, and there is increase in the volume of the thoracic region. So, in simple terms, the volume of chest area increases. So, it's kind of creates a vacuum kind of system where the gases will be taken. In the expiration, the diaphragm relaxes. The intercostal muscles they also relaxes. So that leads to the reduction in the volume of the thoracic region. So the gases will be expired. Okay, so there are a couple of breathing measurements. So in humans, in normal breathing, it moves around 500 ml of air with each breath. So whenever there is exchange of gases, let's say one inspiration and one expiration. So it is the 500 ml of air which is moving. So this is called the tidal volume. Now there is something called the residual volume of air. So after exhaling or after the expiration, about 1200 ml of air remains in the lungs. This is the residual volume. So this volume kind of prevents the lung from collapsing. Then we have inspiratory reserve volume. So this inspiratory reserve volume is 2100 to 3200 ml. So this is the amount of air that remains after forceful expiration. Sorry, after this is the amount of air that can be taken up by forceful inspiration. So normally it is 500 ml, but if somebody is doing forceful inspiration intentionally, or let's say while doing some kind of breathing exercise, the volume could be 2100 to 3200. So you can imagine. So from 500, the volume is increasing to 4 to 6 fold. Now expiratory reserve volume. So if somebody is doing breathing exercise where the expiration is done intentionally, so this volume could be up to 1200 ml. So this is almost like 2.5 fold of what we have as the tidal volume. Now we have something called the vital capacity. So this vital capacity is the total amount of exchangeable air, which is equivalent to tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume plus expiratory reserve volume. So we can add the all the three values. Let's say the tidal volume is 500. So we add this 500. Then we have this inspiratory reserve volume, which is about 3200 ml. Then we have the expiratory reserve volume. So all the three values we can add, and that what we get is the vital capacity. Now there's another term, dead space volume. So even there is some amount of air which remains in the passage or the pathway which never reaches the alveoli. So let's say in case of humans, from nostril to the trachea or the bronchi, there is some amount of air which usually remains there, and that volume is about 150 ml. So if we subtract 150 ml from the tidal volume, from this 500 ml, the volume is 350 ml. So that is the functional volume. So in every breathing cycle, one inspiration and expiration, is only 350 ml of air which is being taken from the environment and reaching to the alveoli. The rest 150 ml just gets stuck in the passage. So this is the kind of pictorial depiction of these things. So this is 500 is tidal volume, 1200 expiratory reserve volume, and inspiratory reserve volume is about 3100 ml. So if you add them, the vital capacity is 4800 ml, and the residual volume is 1200. Which we add this also, we get the total lung capacity. So this is 6000 ml, or in simple terms, 6 liter of volume of air is the total lung capacity. So mechanisms that regulate the breathing. So usually the mechanism of breathing is controlled by the medulla oblongata. So in the medulla oblongata, we have neurons which are the respiratory control centers. So these are chemosensitive neurons. These chemosensitive neurons, they detect the change in the pH. So when the pH goes down, they can detect that particular decrease in the pH. And that particular decrease in pH could be due to the presence of different kind of chemoreceptors. So they are present in the cerebrospinal fluid as well as they are the blood. So they have different locations. They can sense the change in the cerebrospinal fluid as well as in the blood. So the change or the variation in the pH of both this cerebrospinal fluid as well as the blood leads to a message generation to the medulla oblongata, and that dictates the change. Okay, so this is the process how the breathing is regulated by the chemoreceptors. So let's say, for example, there is a process where we having inadequate breathing. So now this inadequate breathing leads to increase in concentration of CO2 in the blood, or in simple terms, the partial pressure value of CO2 increases. So now this increase in CO2 leads to decrease in the blood pH, and this decrease in blood pH will lead to the sensing increase by the peripheral chemoreceptors, which are present in the aortic and carotid bodies. Now they're going to send signal to the medulla oblongata. Now this medulla oblongata will get a message that it needs to increase the breathing. Now it will send sensation or message to increase the breathing. Another process could be that this increase in CO2 leads to decrease in the cerebrospinal fluid pH. Now, because of the decrease in cerebrospinal fluid pH, now again the central chemoreceptors will be activated. So these central chemoreceptors, they'll again sense and send message to the medulla oblongata. Now this medulla oblongata again will leads to the increase in the breathing mechanism. So in a way, if there is inadequate breathing or there is more accumulation of carbon dioxide, it will lead to the activation of the peripheral chemoreceptors as well as the central chemoreceptors. And that will send a message to the medulla oblongata, and that will lead to the increase in the breathing. Okay, so let's see what we have is, so we have hemoglobin and the oxygen transport. So hemoglobin consists of two chains of alpha and two chains of beta. So each chain is associated with the heme group, and this particular heme group has a central iron molecule, iron atom, and this iron atom can bind to a molecule of oxygen. So when hemoglobin loads up oxygen in the lungs, we call it oxyhemoglobin. And when this oxyhemoglobin passes through the capillary in the rest of the body, it loses its oxygen or releases, and we call it deoxyhemoglobin. So this is oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. So this is the partial pressure of oxygen, and this is the percentage saturation on the y-axis. So let's imagine at a situation we have, let's say, around 95-96% of saturation. So from there, if we have normal, so at the normal rest time, this is the amount. So only about I can say that something like 70 78 or 79. So usually about 20% of oxygen is unloaded. However, when the person starts doing exercise, so there was only a reduction of 20%. Here we can see more. So the more amount of oxygen unloads to the tissues. You can see from about 96, 98%, it comes out to be around 38%. So there is a decrease in the 60% saturation. So what I mean to say is that at the normal rest time, there is less requirement of oxygen. So less amount of oxygen is unloaded to the tissues. And at the time of exercise, there's more requirement of oxygen. So more oxygen is unloaded. So you can look at the values from here. So it is about 20 and here it is about 60%. Okay, so what is the effect of pH and temperature on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve? So here you can see that this is normal pH, pH 7.4. If the pH increases, they shift to the left. If the pH decreases, they shift to the right. So one can say that with the increase in the pH, there is less dissociation of oxygen, or there is less unloading of the oxygen. If the pH is lower, then there is more release or more unloading of oxygen. So in a way, this is quite relevant that when the pH goes down, it means that there is more carbon dioxide in the tissues. So that more carbon dioxide needs to be replaced with more oxygen. On the contrary, if there is less CO2, it means the pH is higher. So there less oxygen needs to be released from the blood. And if we increase the temperature, so with the increase in temperature from 37 to 43, there is more unloading of oxygen. In case of decrease in the temperature from 37 to 20, there is less. So in a way, the decrease in pH and the increase in temperature leads to more oxygen delivered to the tissues. And this is about 20% more. Okay, so if we look at the mechanism of transport, so what we see is that in the tissues, CO2 is there. When the process of metabolism is going on, now this CO2 diffuses into plasma, or it could combine to the hemoglobin. Now this CO2 can convert into carbonic acid by the carbonic anhydride, and also it could be into carbonions. Now this is kind of taking place at the tissue level, and at the alveolus there, the CO2 which is dissolved in the plasma can directly be exchanged and it goes to the alveoli, and also the CO2 which is combined with the hemoglobin, that is also released to the alveoli. And the carbonic acid and the carbonate ions which are in the blood cells, they again reverse the process of forming of CO2, and this is also released to the alveoli. So there's also another gas which is called the nitric oxide gas. So hemoglobin also has the ability to hold and release nitric oxide gas. So this nitric oxide gas has very important functions. So this is usually a muscle relaxant. So the different kind of blood vessels, they are relaxed by the presence of nitrous oxide. So let's say, for example, when there is increased demand of blood at the stomach area, when the digestive process is taking place, so the blood vessels which are surrounding the small intestine, so there the blood supply increases due to relaxation of the blood vessels via nitric oxide. So more and more blood reaches there, and more nutrients can be absorbed. So hemoglobin carries nitric oxide also in a special form called the super nitric oxide. So in this form, nitric oxide has acquired an extra electron, and it's able to bind to amino acid cysteine in the hemoglobin. In the lungs, hemoglobin that is dumping CO2 and picking up oxygen also pick up nitric oxide and super nitric oxide. So along with the oxygen, nitric oxide is also being taken up. Since this is playing the relaxation step process of the muscles, it is quite useful. Okay, so this is a kind of summary slide of the gaseous exchange. So let's say here at the RBC and the alveolus, when they are in close contact at the lung surface, there is CO2 diffuses from the blood cells to the alveoli and O2 diffuses from the alveoli to the blood. So now it will go from lungs. If you see this, there is a pulmonary vein which takes the blood to the heart. From there we have systemic circulation. So the oxygen rich blood is carried to the heart and pumped to the body. In the third step, there will be exchange of gases at the tissue level. So tissues which are already having higher concentration of CO2, from there CO2 will diffuse to the blood, and from the RBCs which are having higher concentration of O2 will diffuse. So now this can be easily utilized. So now this oxygen poor blood comes back to the heart and again pumped from the heart to the lungs. So this is the whole 4-step process which is going during the process of respiration. So this is it, what I want to tell you in the process of respiration. So thank you very much for your attention.